The gunshot that rang out through Placitas that scorching August morning in 1878 did not kill Nora Hastings, but it shattered whatever remained of her fragile courage and sent her scrambling behind a water trough with her hands pressed over her ears, and her eyes squeezed so tightly shut that colored spots danced behind her lids. When the shooting stopped and the dust settled, and someone's strong hands pulled her gently to her feet, Nora could not bring herself to look at her rescuer. She kept her gaze fixed firmly on the dusty ground, on the scuffed toes of her worn boots, on anything but the faces of the people who had gathered around to stare at the frightened girl who had thrown herself to the ground at the first sound of trouble. "You all right, miss?" a deep voice asked, and though it was kind, Nora felt her cheeks burn with humiliation. She nodded without looking up, pulled her arm free as gently as she could manage, and hurried away down the wooden sidewalk with her head bowed, and her dark hair falling forward to hide her flaming face. Behind her, she heard murmurs and whispers, and she knew without hearing the words that they were talking about her. They always were. Nora had arrived in Placitas 3 weeks earlier on the afternoon stage, carrying everything she owned in a single battered carpet bag, and a letter of introduction to Mrs. Eleanor Granger, who ran the boarding house on the east end of town. The letter was from a distant cousin of Mrs. Granger's who lived in Kansas City and who had known Nora's mother before she died. It promised that Nora was a good girl, quiet and hardworking, and that she would cause no trouble. The letter had not mentioned that Nora could barely string 2 words together when speaking to strangers, or that she had not looked anyone directly in the eye since her father had died 2 years earlier, leaving her alone in the world at 19 years old with nothing but debts and bad memories. Mrs. Granger had taken her in anyway, given her a small room under the eaves and a job helping with the cooking and cleaning. The work was hard, but Nora did not mind. She preferred to stay busy, to keep her hands occupied and her mind focused on tasks that had clear beginnings and endings. Washing dishes, sweeping floors, kneading bread dough until her arms ached, these were things she understood, things that made sense in a world that often felt bewildering and hostile. What she could not manage was looking people in the face when they spoke to her. Her gaze would slide away, fix itself on a point just past their shoulder or down at their feet, anywhere but their eyes. It had started after her father died, this inability to meet another person's gaze, and it had only grown worse over time. Sometimes she felt as though she were disappearing, becoming less real with each day that passed, until she was little more than a shadow that moved through the world without ever truly touching it. The other boarders at Mrs. Granger's establishment left her mostly alone. There was Mr. Hendricks, a clerk at the general store who kept to himself and spent his evenings reading newspapers by lamplight. There was Miss Tilly Morrison, a seamstress with sharp eyes and sharper opinions about everything and everyone in Placitas. And there was Preston Kane, a cowboy who worked at the Diamond Cross Ranch about 5 miles outside of town, and who came into Placitas every few weeks to collect supplies and blow off steam at the Silver Dollar Saloon. Preston had been staying at Mrs. Granger's for nearly a month now, ever since he had taken a bad fall from a half-broken Mustang and cracked 2 ribs. The ranch foreman had ordered him to take it easy until he healed, which meant lighter duties and more time spent in town than Preston was accustomed to. He was a tall man, lean and weathered, with sun-bleached brown hair and eyes the color of creek water after a storm. Nora judged him to be perhaps 25 or 26, though she had never asked and he had never said. She had noticed him, of course. It was impossible not to notice Preston Kane. He had a presence about him, a quiet confidence that seemed to fill whatever room he entered. He was unfailingly polite to Mrs. Granger and cordial to the other boarders. But there was something in the way he moved, in the way he carried himself, that suggested he was more comfortable on horseback under an open sky than sitting at a dining table making small talk. What Nora had not noticed, because she never looked at anyone long enough to see, was the way Preston watched her. He had first seen her 4 days after he had moved into the boarding house, when she brought a breakfast tray up to his room because his ribs were still too painful for him to navigate the stairs comfortably. She had knocked softly, entered when he called out, and set the tray on the small table by the window without once glancing in his direction. She had moved with quick efficiency, her dark hair pinned up in a simple bun at the nape of her neck, her faded calico dress clean but patched in places. She was small and slight, with fine-boned features and skin that looked like it had rarely seen the sun. "Thank you," Preston had said, and she had nodded without looking up and slipped out of the room like smoke. He had thought about her off and on throughout that day, puzzled by her behavior. The next morning she brought his breakfast again, and again she refused to meet his eyes. This time he watched her more carefully, noted the tension in her shoulders, the way her hands trembled slightly as she set down the tray, the speed with which she retreated toward the door. "Miss," he said, and she froze with her hand on the doorknob. "I did not catch your name." "Nora," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. She was staring at the floorboards. "I am Preston Kane," he said. "Pleased to make your acquaintance." She nodded once, quick and nervous as a startled bird, and was gone before he could say anything else. Over the following weeks, as his ribs healed and he began taking his meals downstairs with the other boarders, Preston found himself increasingly intrigued by the strange, silent girl who moved through the boarding house like a ghost. She never spoke unless spoken to, and even then her answers were brief and delivered to the floor or the wall or the ceiling, never to the person asking the question. She kept her eyes downcast at all times, her shoulders hunched as though she were trying to make herself smaller, less visible. The other boarders seemed not to notice her much at all. Miss Morrison occasionally made sharp comments about Nora's shyness, calling it unnatural and putting on airs, though Preston could see no evidence that Nora thought herself better than anyone. If anything, she seemed to think herself worse, unworthy of occupying space or breathing air or existing at all. It made something twist uncomfortably in Preston's chest, watching her. He wanted to know what had happened to make her this way, what had stolen the light from her eyes and taught her to hide from the world. But he also knew that pushing her, demanding answers or attention, would only drive her further into herself. So instead, he waited. He greeted her every morning at breakfast, a simple "Good morning, Miss Nora," that required no response. He thanked her when she refilled his coffee cup or cleared his plate. He made no sudden movements around her, kept his voice low and even, treated her with the same patient courtesy he might show a nervous colt that had never known a kind hand, and he waited for her to look at him. The morning after the shooting in the street, Nora's hands shook so badly that she dropped a plate while clearing the breakfast dishes. It shattered on the floor in a spray of ceramic shards, and she fell to her knees immediately, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps as she tried to gather up the pieces. "Oh, you clumsy girl," Miss Morrison said from her seat at the table. "That is the second plate this month." "It is fine, Nora," Mrs. Granger said, hurrying in from the kitchen with a broom. "No harm done. Go on and fetch the dustpan, dear." But Nora could not seem to make herself move. She knelt there on the floor with her hands full of broken ceramic, and Preston saw that tears were streaming down her face, though she made no sound. He was up and across the room before he consciously decided to move. He crouched down beside her, careful not to touch her, and said quietly, "Miss Nora, You are going to cut yourself. Let me help you." She shook her head, still not looking at him, and tried to pick up more pieces with trembling fingers. "Please," Preston said, and something in his voice must have reached her because she went still. "Let me help you." Slowly, she opened her hands and let the broken pieces fall. Preston helped her to her feet, noting how cold her hands were despite the warmth of the morning, and guided her gently away from the mess. "Mrs. Granger swept up the broken plate while Preston led Nora out onto the back porch where the air was fresh, and the morning sun was just beginning to burn off the night's coolness. "Sit," he said, gesturing to the old wooden bench that overlooked Mrs. Granger's vegetable garden. Nora sat, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her eyes fixed on the ground. Preston sat down beside her, leaving a respectable distance between them. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. A mockingbird sang somewhere in the cottonwood tree at the edge of the property, and the wind carried the scent of sage and dust from the open country beyond the town. "That shooting yesterday frightened you," Preston said. It was not a question. Nora nodded just barely. "It was just some cowboys blowing off steam," Preston continued, his voice gentle. "No one was hurt. They were shooting at bottles set up on a fence post trying to impress each other. Foolish, maybe, but not dangerous." Another small nod. "Have you been in Placitas long?" Preston asked. 3 weeks, Nora whispered. "Where did you come from? Kansas City?" "That is a long way." She said nothing. Preston leaned back against the porch rail and studied her profile. In the morning light, he could see the delicate curve of her jaw, the long dark lashes that brushed her cheeks, the soft fullness of her mouth. She was, he realized, quite lovely, though she did everything in her power to hide it. "What brought you all this way to Placitas?" he asked. "I had nowhere else to go," she said, so quietly he almost missed it. The words landed in Preston's chest like a stone. He wanted to ask more, to understand, but he could sense that she had already given him more than she was comfortable giving. So instead he said, "Well, I am glad you are here." That made her glance up, just for a fraction of a second. Her eyes were a deep, warm brown, and in that brief moment before she looked away again, Preston saw a flash of surprise and something else, something that might have been hope. It was not much, but it was a beginning. Over the following days, Preston made a point of seeking out small opportunities to speak with Nora. He would find her in the kitchen, up to her elbows in dishwater, and he would lean against the doorframe and tell her about his day at the ranch, about the ornery steer that had broken through 3 fences, about the new string of horses the foreman had purchased, about the way the sunset had painted the mountains gold and purple the evening before. He did not require her to respond, did not press her for conversation. He simply talked, filling the silence with his steady, pleasant voice, and gradually he noticed that her shoulders would relax a little when he was there, that her hands would stop trembling quite so much. Sometimes he would see her in the garden, hanging laundry on the line or picking vegetables for the evening meal, and he would join her, helping without being asked. They would work side by side in companionable quiet, and occasionally Nora would venture a comment about the weather, or the tomatoes coming in nicely, or the hawk she had seen circling overhead that morning. Her voice was always soft, always directed at the ground or the basket in her hands, but Preston cherished each word like a gift. Mrs. Granger noticed, of course. She was a shrewd woman, and not much happened in her boarding house that escaped her attention. One evening after supper, she pulled Preston aside in the hallway and fixed him with a long, measuring look. "That girl has been through something," she said without preamble. "I do not know what exactly, but it was not good. She came here with nothing and no one, and she is as skittish as a rabbit with a coyote on its tail." "I know," Preston said. "You have been kind to her," Mrs. Granger continued. I appreciate that, but I need to know your intentions, Mr. Kane. I will not have her hurt. Preston met her eyes steadily. I would never hurt her, he said. I just want her to know that the world is not all bad, that there are people in it who will be kind without wanting anything in return. Mrs. Granger studied him for another long moment, then nodded. See that you remember that, she said, and walked away. Preston's ribs healed, and he returned to full duties at the Diamond Cross. That meant he was in town less often, sometimes only on Sundays when the ranch hands were given the day off. He found that he missed the boarding house, missed the simple routine of meals at Mrs. Granger's table, missed the sight of Nora moving quietly through the rooms with her eyes downcast and her walls up. He missed the sound of her soft voice, the rare, fleeting moments when she would almost relax in his presence. So he started finding excuses to come into town more often. He would volunteer to pick up supplies, to deliver messages, to check on things that did not really need checking. The other ranch hands teased him about it, suggested he had found himself a sweetheart in Placitas, and Preston did not deny it because it was starting to feel true. Even though he and Nora had never exchanged more than a handful of sentences at a time. It was mid-September when things began to change in earnest. Preston had come into town on a Saturday afternoon to pick up a new bridle the saddler had been repairing, and on impulse, he stopped by the general store and bought a small bag of peppermint sticks. Nora had mentioned once in passing that she liked peppermint, and Preston had filed the information away like a prospector hoarding gold. He found her in the garden behind the boarding house, sitting on the ground with her back against the trunk of the cottonwood tree and a book open in her lap. She was so absorbed in her reading that she did not hear him approach, and for a moment Preston simply stood there, watching her. In the dappled shade, with her guard down and her attention focused on the story in her hands, she looked young and peaceful, almost happy. "Miss Nora," he said quietly, not wanting to startle her. She looked up, and for just a heartbeat, her eyes met his before sliding away to focus on the tree trunk beside his shoulder. It was progress, Preston thought. A month ago, she would not have looked up at all. "Mr. Kane," she said, closing the book carefully, "I did not know you were in town today." "I had some business to attend to," he said, and held out the bag of peppermint sticks. "I remembered you saying you liked these." Nora stared at the bag, her expression unreadable. For a moment, Preston worried he had overstepped, that the gesture was too personal, too much. But then she reached out slowly and took the bag from his hand, her fingers brushing his for just an instant. "Thank you," she said, and her voice was thick with an emotion Preston could not quite name. "That was very kind. May I sit?" he asked, gesturing to the ground beside the tree. She nodded, and Preston lowered himself to the ground, leaving a respectful distance between them. Nora opened the bag and took out one of the peppermint sticks, turning it over in her fingers as though it were something precious. "What are you reading?" Preston asked. She showed him the cover. It was a worn copy of Jane Eyre, the pages yellowed and dog-eared from much reading. "I have not read that one," Preston admitted. "Is it good?" "It is my favorite," Nora said quietly. "I have read it 4 times now. What do you like about it?" She was quiet for a moment, considering. "Jane is like me," she said finally. "Alone in the world and plain and shy. But she is also brave in ways I am not. She stands up for herself. She does not let people make her feel small." Nora's fingers tightened on the book. "I wish I could be more like her." Preston felt that uncomfortable twist in his chest again, the one that came whenever he glimpsed the depths of Nora's unhappiness. "You are braver than you think," he said gently. She shook her head. "I am a coward. I cannot even look people in the eye." "That does not make you a coward," Preston said. "It just means you have been hurt." Nora went very still. For a long moment, the only sound was the whisper of wind through the cottonwood leaves and the distant shouts of children playing somewhere in town. "My father," Nora said at last, her voice barely audible, "was not a kind man, especially when he drank, which was often. He would say terrible things, and sometimes he would." She trailed off, swallowed hard. "After my mother died, it got worse. I learned to keep my eyes down, to make myself small and quiet, because if he did not notice me, then he could not hurt me." Preston's hands clenched into fists where they rested on his knees. He wanted to find Nora's father and make him pay for every moment of fear he had inflicted on his daughter, but the man was dead and beyond justice or vengeance. "He died 2 years ago," Nora continued. "Fell down drunk and hit his head. I should have been relieved, but instead I just felt lost. And I found that I could not stop keeping my eyes down, could not stop trying to be invisible, even though there was no one left to hide from. It is as though I forgot how to be any other way." She finally turned to look at him then, really look at him, and Preston found himself staring into those warm brown eyes and seeing all the pain and loneliness and desperate hope that lived there. His breath caught in his throat. "I do not know how to stop being afraid," Nora whispered. "I do not know how to be the person I might have been if things had been different." "You do not have to be anyone but who you are right now," Preston said, holding her gaze. "And if you want to change, if you want to learn to feel safe again, I will help you, if you will let me." "Why?" Nora asked, and there were tears shining in her eyes now. "Why would you care about helping me?" Preston reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and took her hand in his. Her fingers were small and cold, and they trembled in his grasp. "Because when I look at you," he said, "I see someone worth caring about. I see someone strong and kind and good, even if you cannot see those things in yourself yet. And because somewhere along the way, these past weeks, I have come to care for you a great deal." A tear spilled down Nora's cheek, and then another. "I cannot imagine why," she said, but she did not pull her hand away. "Then let me show you," Preston said. They sat together under the cottonwood tree as the afternoon shadows lengthened. And for the first time since her father had died, Nora allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, there was a way forward into a life that was not defined by fear. The weeks that followed were a revelation for Nora. Preston began calling on her formally, with Mrs. Granger's permission and supervision, and he courted her with a patience and gentleness that made her feel like something fragile and precious. He took her on walks through the scrubby hills outside town, pointing out plants and animal tracks, telling her stories about his childhood on a ranch in Texas, and the journey that had eventually brought him to New Mexico territory. He never pushed her to talk when she was not ready, but he listened intently when she did choose to speak, as though every word she said mattered. Slowly, carefully, Nora began to open up like a flower that had been too long in shadow. She told him about her mother, who had been gentle and sad and had died of influenza when Nora was 15. She told him about the years of fear that followed, the constant vigilance required to avoid her father's unpredictable rages. She told him about the loneliness of being utterly alone in the world, unmoored from any sense of home or belonging. And Preston listened and held her hand and told her that she was not alone anymore. One crisp October afternoon, they rode out together on horses borrowed from the livery stable. Preston had promised to show Nora a place he had discovered shortly after arriving in Placitas, a hidden canyon with a spring-fed pool surrounded by red rock walls. The ride took about an hour, following a narrow trail that wound through juniper and piñon pine, and by the time they arrived, Nora's cheeks were flushed from the exercise and the cool air. The canyon was every bit as beautiful as Preston had described. The pool was crystal clear, reflecting the cloudless sky, and the rock walls glowed amber and crimson in the afternoon light. Nora slid down from her horse and stood at the edge of the water, marveling at the stillness, the sense of peace that seemed to emanate from the very stones. "It is perfect," she said softly. Preston came to stand beside her. "I thought you would like it." They sat on the smooth rocks beside the pool, and Preston unpacked the simple lunch Mrs. Granger had prepared: bread and cheese and apples, along with a jar of cold tea. They ate in comfortable silence, listening to the whisper of wind and the occasional call of a bird. "I have been thinking," Nora said after a while, "about what you said, about learning to feel safe again." Preston looked at her, waiting. "I think I am beginning to," she continued. "When I am with you, I do not feel so afraid. I do not feel like I need to hide." She turned to face him fully, and though she had to work up the courage to do it, she looked directly into his eyes. "You make me feel like I matter." "You do matter," Preston said fiercely. "You matter to me. More than I know how to put into words." "I care for you too," Nora said, and saying it aloud felt like stepping off a cliff, terrifying and exhilarating all at once. "I think I have been falling in love with you, and it frightens me because I never thought I would be brave enough to love anyone." Preston reached up and cupped her face gently in his hands, his thumbs brushing away the tears that had started to fall. "You are the bravest person I know," he said, "and I have been in love with you since the day you told me your name." He kissed her then, soft and careful, as though she might break. Nora's eyes fluttered closed and she leaned into him, her hands coming up to rest on his chest where she could feel the steady beat of his heart. The kiss was sweet and chaste and full of promise, and when they finally pulled apart, Nora was smiling. It was the first time Preston had seen her truly smile, and it transformed her face, made her luminous. "There you are," he said wonderingly. "I knew you were in there somewhere." Nora laughed, a sound of pure joy, and kissed him again. They returned to Placitas as the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink and gold. Mrs. Granger took one look at their faces when they walked through the door and smiled knowingly, but she said nothing, simply shooed them in for supper. That night, lying in her narrow bed under the eaves, Nora stared up at the ceiling and thought about the future for the first time in years without feeling a crushing weight of despair. Instead, she felt something light and warm and hopeful unfurling in her chest. She thought about Preston's smile, the steadiness in his eyes, the way his hand felt wrapped around hers. She thought about the possibility of a life built on trust and kindness rather than fear. She thought about how far she had come from the frightened girl who had arrived in Placitas just 2 months earlier, and she thought that maybe, just maybe, she was going to be all right. Preston proposed to Nora on a cold December morning, kneeling in Mrs. Granger's parlor with a simple gold band he had saved 3 months' wages to buy. His hands were shaking, and his carefully prepared speech went clean out of his head the moment Nora looked at him with those warm brown eyes. So in the end he just said, "Will you marry me, Nora? Will you let me spend the rest of my life showing you how loved you are?" Nora said yes through happy tears, and Mrs. Granger cried and declared it the most romantic thing she had ever witnessed, and Miss Morrison grudgingly admitted that she supposed Preston was a decent sort and Nora could do worse. They were married on the first day of the new year, 1879, in the small church at the edge of Placitas with Mrs. Granger and the minister's wife as witnesses. Nora wore a simple dress of cream-colored muslin that Mrs. Granger had helped her sew, and she carried a bouquet of dried wildflowers because there were no fresh ones to be had in January. Preston wore his best shirt and a new string tie, and when the minister pronounced them husband and wife, He kissed Nora with such tenderness that several of the ladies in attendance had to dab at their eyes with handkerchiefs. The foreman at the Diamond Cross had offered Preston the use of a small cabin on the ranch property, one that had been built for a previous foreman who had since moved on. It was just 2 rooms, a main room with a cook stove and a table, and a bedroom barely large enough for a bed and a washstand, but it had a good roof and sturdy walls and windows that looked out over miles of rolling grassland. To Nora, who had never had a home of her own, it was a palace. Preston carried her over the threshold on their wedding night, both of them laughing, and set her down gently in the middle of the main room. A fire was crackling in the small stove, filling the space with warmth, and someone had left a basket of supplies on the table: coffee and flour and sugar, a tin of beans, fresh eggs wrapped in cloth. "Welcome home, Mrs. Kane," Preston said, and Nora's heart swelled with happiness at the sound of her new name. That night they lay together in the narrow bed, and Preston held Nora close, his arms wrapped around her as though she were something infinitely precious. He was patient and gentle, mindful of her inexperience and the scars left by her father's cruelty, and when she wept afterward, it was not from pain but from the overwhelming relief of being touched with love instead of violence. "I've got you," Preston murmured into her hair. "You are safe. I have got you." And Nora believed him. Their life together fell into a rhythm that was both challenging and deeply satisfying. Preston's work at the ranch was demanding, often requiring him to be gone from dawn until well after dark, especially during the spring when the cattle were driven to new grazing lands and the horses needed breaking and training. Nora spent her days caring for their small home, cooking and cleaning and tending the little vegetable garden she planted behind the cabin. It was hard work, but it was work she did for herself and for Preston, and that made all the difference. She still struggled sometimes with her shyness, with the old habit of keeping her eyes down and making herself small. But Preston was always there to remind her that she was safe, that she was valued, that she had every right to take up space in the world. When they rode into Placitas for supplies or church on Sundays, he would keep her hand in his, a steady anchor, and gradually Nora found that she could look the shopkeeper in the eye when she placed an order, could exchange pleasantries with the other ranch wives without her voice shaking. She even managed a tentative friendship with Mary Kathleen Dawson, the wife of one of the other cowboys at Diamond Cross, a cheerful woman with red hair and a boisterous laugh, who had 3 young children and opinions about everything. Mary Kathleen was the opposite of shy, loud and vivacious and entirely comfortable in her own skin, but she was also kind and surprisingly perceptive. She seemed to understand without being told that Nora needed patience, needed to be drawn out gently rather than overwhelmed. "You remind me of a mare I had when I was a girl," Mary Kathleen said one afternoon as she and Nora sat shelling peas on Nora's front step. "Prettiest thing you ever saw, but nervous as a cat. My father bought her off a man who had beaten her, and she would not let anyone near her for months. But I was patient, and eventually she learned to trust me. By the time I got married and had to sell her, she was the sweetest horse you could ask for." Nora was not sure how she felt about being compared to an abused horse, but she understood the sentiment behind the words. "Did you mind?" she asked. "Being patient, I mean, it must have been frustrating." "Not really," Mary Kathleen said, shrugging. "Some things are worth the effort, and you can't rush trust. It comes in its own time or not at all." It was good advice, and Nora tucked it away in her heart alongside all the other small kindnesses people had shown her since she came to Placitas. Spring turned to summer, and summer to fall, and Nora found that she was happy in a way she had never imagined possible. The darkness that had shadowed her for so long was still there, lurking at the edges of her awareness, but it no longer consumed her. She had good days and bad days, times when the old fears rose up and threatened to pull her under, but Preston was always there to pull her back, to remind her that she was not alone anymore. One evening in late October, as they sat on the front step of the cabin watching the sun sink behind the distant mountains, Preston said, "I have been thinking about buying some land." Nora looked at him in surprise. "Land," he nodded. "There is a section up near the foothills that is coming up for sale. Good grazing, a reliable creek running through it. The foreman said he would help me get a loan from the bank if I wanted to start my own herd. It would be hard work, especially at first, but in a few years we could have a real ranch, something that is ours." "A ranch," Nora repeated, trying to wrap her mind around the idea. "You mean leave Diamond Cross?" "Eventually, yes," Preston said. "Not right away. We would need to build it up slowly. Maybe keep working at Diamond Cross for a while until we can afford to go out on our own. But I want to build something for us, Nora. Something we can pass on to our children someday." Children. The word sent a flutter of nervous excitement through Nora's chest. They had not talked much about children, though she knew Preston wanted them. The thought of being a mother terrified her. What if she did not know how to be a good parent? What if she made the same mistakes her father had made? But it also filled her with a longing she had not expected. "You think we could do it?" she asked quietly. Preston took her hand and laced his fingers through hers. "I think we could do anything as long as we are together." Nora leaned her head against his shoulder and looked out at the vast expanse of land spread before them, the endless sky turning purple and gold in the fading light. "Then let's do it," she said. "Let's build something of our own." Preston kissed the top of her head and pulled her closer. "We will," he promised, "one step at a time." In early November, they rode out to see the land Preston had been talking about. It was about 8 miles north of the Diamond Cross, nestled in a valley between two low hills with the Sandia Mountains rising in the distance. The creek Preston had mentioned ran clear and cold through the center of the property, lined with cottonwoods that were shedding their golden leaves onto the water. The grass was still green despite the lateness of the season, and Nora could see evidence of deer and elk that used the area as a watering place. "What do you think?" Preston asked, watching her face carefully. Nora turned in a slow circle, taking it all in. The land was wild and beautiful, untouched by human hands, full of potential. She could picture a house here, a barn, corrals for horses and cattle. She could picture children playing by the creek, climbing the cottonwood trees growing up with the mountains as their backyard. "I think it is perfect," she said. Preston's face split into a wide grin. "Then I will talk to the bank." The process of securing a loan took longer than Preston had hoped. The banker was skeptical about lending money to a young cowboy with limited collateral, but Preston was persistent. And eventually, he managed to negotiate terms that were manageable, if not ideal. They would have 15 years to pay off the loan, with interest, and in the meantime they would need to continue working at Diamond Cross to make ends meet. It was daunting, but Nora and Preston were young and strong and determined. They spent that winter making plans, sketching out where they would build the house and barn, calculating how many head of cattle they could afford to start with, dreaming about the future they were creating together. In February, on a cold afternoon with snow threatening in the heavy gray clouds overhead, Nora realized that her monthly courses were late. At first she dismissed it as stress or the result of the hard work she had been doing, but when another week passed and still nothing happened, she began to suspect the truth. She told Preston that evening, stumbling over the words, unsure how he would react. His face went through a series of expressions: surprise, wonder, joy before he swept her up in his arms and spun her around, laughing. "We are going to have a baby," he said, setting her down carefully as though she might break. "Nora, we are going to have a baby. Are you happy?" she asked, needing to hear him say it. "Happy?" Preston cupped her face in his hands and kissed her soundly. "I am the happiest man alive." Nora's pregnancy was not an easy one. She was sick most mornings through the first few months, so nauseated that she could barely keep down water, let alone food. Preston worried constantly, hovering over her and trying to tempt her with bland foods, but Nora waved away his concern and insisted she would be fine. "Women have been having babies since the beginning of time," she told him. "I am not special." "You are special to me," Preston said stubbornly. By the time spring arrived, the worst of the sickness had passed, and Nora began to feel more like herself. Her belly was starting to round out, just enough that she could not quite button her skirts anymore, and she found herself constantly touching the small swell, marveling at the life growing inside her. They broke ground on their new property in April, and with the help of several men from Diamond Cross, they managed to raise the frame of a small house before the summer heat became too oppressive. It was exhausting work, and Preston often came home at night too tired to do more than eat a quick supper and fall into bed. But there was a light in his eyes that had not been there before, a sense of purpose and pride. By late August, the house was mostly finished 4 rooms instead of the 2 they had been living in, with real glass windows and a stone fireplace and a covered porch that looked out over the creek. It was simple and rough around the edges, but it was theirs, built with their own hands and paid for with their own sweat. They moved in on a blazing hot afternoon, their few possessions loaded onto a borrowed wagon. Nora was 7 months pregnant by then, her belly round and heavy, and she had to stop frequently to catch her breath. But when she stood in the doorway of their new home and looked around at the empty rooms waiting to be filled with life and love, she felt a profound sense of accomplishment. "We did it," she said, turning to Preston with tears in her eyes. "We really did it." "We did," Preston agreed, pulling her close and resting his hand on her swollen belly. "And this is just the beginning." Their son was born on a cold October night, 2 weeks before Nora's due date, in the bedroom of their new house with Mary Kathleen Dawson serving as midwife and Preston pacing anxiously in the main room. It was a long and difficult labor, lasting nearly 20 hours, and there were moments when Nora was convinced she was going to die. But Mary Kathleen was calm and competent, talking her through the contractions, reminding her to breathe. And finally, just as the first light of dawn was beginning to creep through the windows, the baby emerged with a furious wail. "It is a boy," Mary Kathleen announced, holding up the squalling, red-faced infant. "A healthy boy." Nora collapsed back against the pillows, exhausted and overwhelmed, and watched as Mary Kathleen cleaned the baby and wrapped him in a soft blanket. Then the older woman placed the bundle carefully in Nora's arms, and Nora looked down at her son's tiny, scrunched face and felt her heart crack wide open. "Preston," she called weakly. "Preston, come meet your son." The bedroom door flew open and Preston burst in, his face pale and anxious. But when he saw Nora sitting up in bed with the baby in her arms, his expression transformed into something Nora had no words for. He crossed the room in 3 long strides and sat down carefully on the edge of the bed, staring down at the tiny person they had created together. "He is perfect," Preston whispered, reaching out to touch one impossibly small hand. The baby's fingers closed around Preston's thumb, gripping with surprising strength, and Preston made a choked sound. "He is absolutely perfect. What should we name him?" Nora asked. They had discussed names endlessly over the past months, but had never quite settled on one. Now, looking at their son's face, Preston said, "What about Daniel, after your mother's father?" Nora's eyes filled with tears. Her grandfather had been one of the few bright spots in her childhood, a kind man who had told her stories and made her laugh before he died when she was 8 years old. "Daniel," she repeated. "Daniel Kane. I like that." "Daniel it is, then," Preston said, and leaned over to kiss first the baby's forehead and then Nora's lips. "Thank you," he whispered against her mouth. "Thank you for him. Thank you for everything." Nora closed her eyes and held her family close, and thought that she had never been so tired or so happy in her entire life. The first year of Daniel's life was a blur of sleepless nights and endless feedings, and the constant low-level anxiety that came with being responsible for such a tiny, fragile person. Nora found motherhood both harder and more rewarding than she had anticipated. There were moments of pure joy: Daniel's first smile, the way he would light up when Preston came home in the evenings, the sweet weight of him sleeping on her chest, but there were also moments of deep fear. What if she was not a good enough mother? What if she failed him somehow? What if the darkness that had haunted her own childhood somehow infected his? Preston was endlessly patient with her worries, always ready to reassure her that she was doing a wonderful job, that Daniel was healthy and happy and clearly adored her. And gradually, as the months passed and Daniel grew from a helpless newborn into a curious, active baby, Nora's confidence grew too. They worked the ranch together, Preston handling the cattle and horses while Nora managed the house and garden and looked after Daniel. It was grueling work, and there were times when Nora wondered if they had bitten off more than they could chew, but they were making progress. Slowly but surely, they were building something real and lasting. By the time Daniel was 2 years old, toddling around on chubby legs and chattering in a mix of real words and nonsense syllables, Nora discovered she was pregnant again. This time the pregnancy was easier, and when their second son was born in the spring of 1882, the labor was shorter and less frightening. They named him Thomas, after Preston's father, and he was a calm, easy baby who seemed content to simply observe the world around him with his father's storm-colored eyes. Life settled into a comfortable rhythm. The ranch continued to grow, and within a few years they had enough cattle and horses to turn a modest profit. Preston hired on a couple of ranch hands to help with the heavy work, and Nora took over the business side of things, keeping the books and managing their accounts with a head for numbers that surprised both of them. Mary Kathleen remained a close friend, visiting often with her own brood of children who would play with Daniel and Thomas in the creek, while the women sat on the porch and talked. Nora had other friends, now 2 women from church, the wives of neighboring ranchers, and she no longer felt the crushing isolation that had defined so much of her early life. She still had difficult days, times when the old anxiety would rise up and make it hard to breathe, when she would find herself unable to meet someone's eyes or speak above a whisper. But those days were fewer and farther between now, and Preston always knew how to bring her back to herself, to remind her that she was strong and capable and loved. On a warm evening in June of 1885, Nora and Preston sat on their porch watching the sun set over the mountains. Daniel and Thomas were finally asleep after a long day of playing, and the house was blissfully quiet. Preston had his arm around Nora's shoulders, and she was leaning against him, feeling the steady rise and fall of his breathing. "Do you remember," Preston said quietly, "that first morning when you brought breakfast to my room at Mrs. Granger's and you would not look at me?" Nora smiled. "I remember. I thought you were going to think I was strange." "I did think you were strange," Preston admitted, and Nora elbowed him lightly in the ribs. "But I also thought you were fascinating, I wanted to understand you, to know what had put such sadness in your eyes." "And now you do," Nora said. "And now I do," Preston agreed. "And I love you more than I thought it was possible to love another person." Nora tilted her head up to look at him, meeting his eyes without hesitation. It still gave her a small thrill, being able to do that, to hold someone's gaze without fear. "I love you too," she said. "You saved me, you know. From myself, from the past, from all of it." Preston shook his head. "You saved yourself, Nora. I just waited until you were ready to look at me." Nora thought about that, about the scared, broken girl she had been when she first arrived in Placitas, and the woman she had become. She thought about the journey from there to here, about all the small steps and moments of courage that had brought her to this place of peace and belonging. "We saved each other," she said finally, and kissed him as the stars began to emerge in the darkening sky. The years continued to pass, bringing with them both joys and sorrows. In 1887, Nora gave birth to a daughter they named Rose, a tiny, delicate baby with dark hair and her mother's warm brown eyes. She was followed 2 years later by another son, James, who was loud and rambunctious from the moment he entered the world. The ranch prospered, growing from a modest operation to one of the more successful spreads in the area. Preston proved to have a gift for breeding horses, and the Kane horses became known throughout New Mexico territory for their quality and temperament. They paid off their loan to the bank 3 years ahead of schedule, and Preston used the freed-up capital to buy additional land and expand their herd. Nora threw herself into community life, helping to establish a small schoolhouse in Placitas, and serving as one of the teachers when they could not afford to hire someone from outside. She taught the children of ranchers and farmers and shop owners to read and write and do arithmetic, and she found that she loved it. There was something deeply satisfying about watching young minds open up and grow, about helping shape the next generation into something better than the last. Daniel grew into a serious, thoughtful boy who loved books and learning, while Thomas was more practical, always happiest when he was working alongside his father with the animals. Rose was gentle and sweet-natured, with a gift for music that emerged when she was barely 6 years old. James was the wild one, always getting into trouble and coming home covered in mud or with torn clothes, but with such a sunny disposition that it was impossible to stay angry with him for long. Watching her children grow, Nora sometimes thought about her own childhood and marveled at how different things could be. Her children knew nothing of fear or violence or the need to make themselves invisible. They were confident and loud and unafraid to take up space in the world, and Nora was fiercely grateful for that. In 1893, when Nora was 34 years old and Preston was 39, they celebrated their 14th wedding anniversary. Preston surprised her by taking her back to the hidden canyon, where he had first told her he loved her, leaving the children with Mary Kathleen for the day. They rode out in the early morning before the heat of the day set in, and by the time they arrived at the canyon, Nora's face was flushed and her hair had come loose from its pins. The canyon looked exactly as it had all those years ago, the pool crystal clear and the red rock walls glowing in the sunlight. They dismounted and Preston spread a blanket on the smooth stones, and they sat together, eating the lunch Nora had packed and talking about everything and nothing. "I have been thinking," Preston said after a while, "about how far we have come. Do you remember when you told me you did not know how to stop being afraid?" "I remember," Nora said. "Are you still afraid?" he asked. Nora considered the question carefully. "Sometimes," she admitted. "Not like I used to be, but there are still moments when the old fears come back. When something happens and I feel like that scared girl again, the one who could not look anyone in the eye." "And what do you do when that happens?" I remember that I am not her anymore, Nora said. I remember that I have you and our children and a life that is full of good things. I remember that I am stronger than I think I am. She smiled at him. And I look you in the eye and I remind myself that I am safe. Preston reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, his touch achingly gentle. You are the strongest person I know, he said, and I am so proud of the woman you have become. I could not have done it without you, Nora said. We did it together, Preston corrected. Just like everything else. They lay back on the blanket and watched the clouds drift overhead, fingers intertwined, and Nora thought about the girl she had been, and the woman she was now and the long, difficult journey that had connected the two. She thought about Preston's patience, his unwavering belief in her, the way he had waited until she was ready to look at him instead of demanding that she change to suit him. She thought about love, real love, the kind that was built on trust and respect, and the determination to help each other become the best versions of themselves. And she thought about how grateful she was for all of it, for every struggle and triumph and ordinary day that had brought her to this moment. As the afternoon sun began to sink toward the horizon, they packed up their things and prepared to ride back home. But before they mounted their horses, Preston pulled Nora close and kissed her, deep and slow and full of promise. Here is to 14 more years, he said. And 14 after that, and as many as we get. As many as we get, Nora agreed, and she kissed him back, her eyes wide open, looking directly into his storm-colored gaze without a trace of fear. They rode home in the golden light of evening, side by side, and when they crested the last hill and saw their ranch spread out before them, the house and barn and corrals, the cattle grazing in the pasture, the thin ribbon of smoke rising from the chimney where Mary Kathleen was undoubtedly preparing supper, Nora felt a surge of contentment so profound it took her breath away. This was home. This was family. This was the life she had built from the ruins of her past, and it was more than she had ever dared to hope for. The children came running when they heard the horses, Daniel and Thomas racing to see who could reach them first, Rose following at a more sedate pace with James toddling behind her. Preston dismounted and scooped up James, tossing him in the air and catching him while the little boy shrieked with delight. Daniel took the reins of Preston's horse to lead it to the barn, already responsible beyond his years, while Thomas peppered them with questions about where they had been and what they had seen. Nora slid down from her own horse, and Rose came to stand beside her, slipping her small hand into Nora's larger one. "Did you have a good day, Mama?" Rose asked. "The best day," Nora said, squeezing her daughter's hand. "I am glad," Rose said simply and leaned against her mother's side. Mary Kathleen appeared in the doorway, wiping her hands on her apron. "There you are," she called. "Supper is about ready if you are hungry." "Starving," Preston said, and led the way inside with James still perched on his shoulders. That night, after the children were in bed and Mary Kathleen had gone home to her own family, Nora and Preston sat at their kitchen table with cups of coffee, and the lamp turned low. They did not talk much, just sat in the comfortable silence of two people who knew each other so well that words were often unnecessary. But after a while, Nora reached across the table and took Preston's hand. "Thank you," she said quietly. "For what?" Preston asked. "For waiting," Nora said. "For being patient with me, for loving me even when I did not know how to love myself." Preston brought her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles. "It was easy," he said. "You were always worth waiting for." Nora smiled, and in the lamplight her eyes shone with tears. But they were happy tears, tears of gratitude and love and the kind of deep, abiding joy that comes from knowing you are exactly where you are meant to be. The years ahead would bring their share of challenges, a drought that lasted 3 years and nearly broke them financially, a serious illness that swept through Placitas and took several lives, including that of kind Mrs. Granger, the constant hard work and worry that came with running a ranch and raising a family. But they would face it all together, Nora and Preston, side by side as they always had been. Daniel would grow up to become a lawyer, one of the first attorneys in New Mexico territory, to focus on protecting the rights of small ranchers against the encroachment of larger interests. Thomas would take over the ranch when Preston was ready to retire, proving to be just as skilled as his father in breeding and training horses. Rose would marry a kind schoolteacher and move to Santa Fe, where she would open a music school and raise 3 children of her own. And James would become a surveyor, traveling throughout the West, mapping new territories and writing letters home full of adventure and enthusiasm. But all of that was still to come. On this night in June of 1893, sitting in their kitchen with their children sleeping safely under their roof, and the man she loved holding her hand, Nora Hastings Kane felt nothing but peace. She thought about the girl who had arrived in Placitas 15 years earlier, too shy to look anyone in the eye, carrying all her worldly possessions in a single carpet bag, and all her pain in a heart that felt too heavy to bear. She thought about the cowboy who had waited, who had seen past the fear and brokenness to the person she could become, who had loved her with a patience and gentleness that had taught her to love herself. And she thought about the journey from there to here, from darkness to light, from fear to love. It had not been easy. There had been setbacks and struggles and days when she had wanted to give up. But she had not given up, and Preston had not let her. And together they had built something beautiful and lasting out of the broken pieces of her past. She stood up and walked around the table, and Preston pulled her onto his lap, wrapping his arms around her waist. Nora rested her head on his shoulder and closed her eyes, breathing in the familiar scent of him, leather and sage, and the faint tang of horse. "I love you," she whispered. "I love you too," Preston murmured into her hair. "Always." They sat like that for a long time, wrapped in each other's arms, and when they finally stood and made their way to bed, Nora knew that whatever tomorrow brought, whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. Because that was what love was. Not the grand gestures or passionate declarations, though those had their place. No, real love was this: showing up every day, being patient when patience was needed, offering strength when strength was required, and never, ever giving up on the person you had chosen to build a life with. It was Preston waiting for Nora to look at him, knowing that she would when she was ready. It was Nora finding the courage to meet his eyes and seeing nothing there but acceptance and love. It was 2 broken people healing each other, one day at a time, until they were no longer broken at all. It was, Nora thought as sleep began to claim her, the greatest gift she had ever received. And it was one she would treasure for the rest of her days, however many or few those days might be. But as it turned out, there were many days ahead for both of them. They grew old together, Nora and Preston, watching their children have children of their own, seeing the ranch prosper and the territory of New Mexico eventually become a state. They marked 50 years of marriage in 1929, surrounded by children and grandchildren and even a few great-grandchildren, and when Preston gave the toast at the celebration, his voice was still strong despite his 75 years. "To my wife," he said, raising his glass, "who taught me that the best things in life are worth waiting for, who showed me that courage is not the absence of fear, but the choice to keep going despite it, who gave me a life richer and fuller than I ever dreamed possible. I love you, Nora Kane, and I would wait 1,000 lifetimes for you to look at me the way you do now." Nora, at 70 years old, looked at her husband across the crowded room and felt the same flutter of emotion she had felt the first time he told her he loved her in a hidden canyon all those years ago. She stood, her joints protesting slightly, and crossed to where he stood. And in front of all their family and friends, she looked him directly in the eye and said, "And I would choose you 1,000 times over. You were worth looking at, Preston Kane." They kissed then, to the cheers and applause of everyone gathered, and Nora thought that if this was not a happy ending, she did not know what was. Preston passed away peacefully in his sleep in the winter of 1931, and Nora grieved him with a depth of sorrow that matched the depth of love she had felt for him. But she did not let the grief consume her, because she knew that was not what he would have wanted. Instead, she carried on, living with Thomas and his family at the ranch, helping with the grandchildren, tending her garden, writing letters to her children and grandchildren scattered across New Mexico and beyond. She lived to the remarkable age of 83, passing away in the spring of 1942 surrounded by her children. Her last words were to Daniel, who sat holding her hand as she slipped away. "Tell your father," she whispered, her voice barely audible, "tell him I am ready to look at him again now." And then she closed her eyes for the last time, a smile on her face, and went to find the cowboy who had waited for her to be brave enough to meet his gaze all those years ago. They buried her next to Preston in the small cemetery on the hill overlooking their ranch, under a cottonwood tree with a view of the mountains they had both loved. The headstone was simple, bearing both their names and dates and a single line that Daniel had chosen. She looked, and he waited, and together they built a life of love. And in the years that followed, whenever the children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren would ask about Nora and Preston, about the great romance that had founded their family, the stories would always start the same way. She was too shy to look anyone in the eye. The cowboy waited until she looked at him. And when she finally did, they fell in love and lived happily ever after, just like in the fairy tales, except this one was real and true and happened right here in Placitas, New Mexico, in the days of the Wild West when the land was still new and anything seemed possible for those brave enough to reach for it.